Hello there. Here I have a story that I wrote, and it's a historical narrative, which means that it is a fictional story, but it's set within a real time period. So I really like to read historical fiction. And what's cool about historical fiction is that you learn about history and you enjoy a really good story at the same time because it's a story, like I said, it's a fictional story, but it's like a unicorn can't suddenly show up in the story or a dragon can't suddenly show up because it's set within a fully real historical time frame. And so this story here is set within the time frame of the California Gold Rush. And what this assignment is I'm going to read you this example of a historical narrative. And remember, a narrative is a story. So it's a piece of writing that has the different story elements in it, like plot, character, conflict, theme, and setting. And also, recall that you learned three major writing genres in fifth grade. You learned how to write narratives, which are stories, and you learned how to write opinion pieces and informational essays, which are both different kinds of essays. And the nice thing about informational essays and opinion pieces is that they really follow the same format. They're both essays, and you can use the same five paragraph format for both of them, where first you write your introduction, then you have your three main ideas, and each of those are their own paragraph, and then you have your conclusion paragraph. And so, if you're writing an informational essay, your introductory paragraph is where you introduce your main topic and your three main ideas, which are like the three main questions that you're going to answer about your topic. And then your conclusion paragraph restates your main idea or your main topic and your three main ideas. If you're writing a opinion piece, it's really the same thing. Except instead of having a main topic, you have your main opinion, and then your three main ideas become your three reasons for your opinion. So in your introductory paragraph, you would introduce what is your opinion and what are your three main reasons for your opinion. And then each of your three main body paragraphs would be going into detail about each of your three reasons for your opinion. Then your conclusion paragraph would restate your opinion and your three reasons for your opinion. And the narrative is a little harder. You can't really, there's not one format really, but I like to show that you can, if you want to simplify it, use that same five paragraph format for your narrative too. If you want to write your narrative that way, you make your first paragraph here, it only has one job, actually a couple jobs, but one main job, and it's to introduce the setting and to introduce your main character. So it's really two jobs because you're introducing two things, but it's also, you could also see it as one job because your job is to introduce, to let the reader know what is this story, where and when is this story taking place, and who is this story about. And of course, the other job is to hook your reader. You want your introductory paragraph to hook the reader, to introduce the reader to your main character, and to introduce the reader to your setting. So why do I want to keep reading this story? That's hooking your reader. Who is this story about? That's introducing your main character. And where and when is this story taking place? That's introducing the setting. Then your three main body paragraphs can each just be about one of your three main events. You can just break your story up into three big events or three main events, and then just dedicate one paragraph to each of your three main events. So that's this paragraph here, and this paragraph here. Those are my three main events. And then my last paragraph is just explaining how the story ends. So, again, if you want to use a five paragraph format for a narrative, in your first paragraph, hook the reader, introduce the main character, and introduce your setting. In your next three paragraphs. Make each of those three main body paragraphs be about one of your three main events in your story, and then have your last paragraph, which is the conclusion paragraph, have that be the conclusion to the story. How does the story end? And of course, you want to make sure that your story has all the story elements. Plot, that means things need to happen inside of your story. Characters, that means there needs to be people doing things inside of your story. Your story needs to have a main character who the story is mainly about, and also maybe even some side characters who come into the story in other ways. Plot, character, conflict. There needs to be some problem that your main character has to face and overcome in your story. And then theme, that's the one. Theme is the one story element that I think you can almost really not worry about, because if you tell a good story, theme will naturally come out, even if you as the author don't really plan on having a theme. And even if you don't know what the theme is, the theme will kind of like naturally bubble out of your subconscious if you tell a really good story. So plot, character, conflict, theme, setting. And of course, setting is where and when your story takes place. It needs to have all of those story elements. So I'm going to read this story to you now. And it's just an example of a historical narrative. And your assignment after this video will be to write your own story set in any of the historical time frames that we've studied in history this year. You could put it in the 1500s in Mexico during the fall of the Aztec Empire. You could put it in the 13 American colonies during the Revolutionary War. You could do like I did and put it in California during the California gold rush. It's up to you. Any of the time frames and places that we've studied this year during history, you can write a story in any of those settings at all. Okay? Anyone that you want. My story is called Ephrem's Fortune, and here it is. The dirt and sand sifted through the strainer as the young man rocked it back and forth in his grubby hands. A young, ruddy, handsome man, clearly of Irish descent, perhaps in his early 20s, with wild red hair, scruffy clothes, and a dirty face. He was squatting next to the Sacramento River in the wilds of California. Aside from the sound of the river water rushing past him, the loudest sound was the chirping of birds in the trees above him. Ephrem, that was the young man's name, noticed neither of these sounds. He was completely intent upon the sandy mud sifting through the crisscross frame of his strainer. Every few moments he dipped his device into the sand beneath the water by the banks of the river and started over. For over 2 months, Ephrem had been doing nearly this same thing every day for hours and hours. Although he had high hopes of becoming a wealthy man when he left New York City, and had even managed to keep his hopes high and alive during the difficult and dangerous journey across the American continent to get to where he was, ever since reaching California, he had found nothing but the tiniest flakes of gold imaginable. So far, he hadn't even made enough to cover the expenses of his journey, let alone become rich. Every night he had gone to bed disappointed. Yet every morning he rose, stiff from sleeping outside, but still full of hope that this day would be the one that would change his fortune forever. And notice all I did in that paragraph was um, introduced my main character and the setting, and hopefully I also got you wanting to hear more of the story. So that's what hooking the reader is. Now, in this next paragraph, it's my first main event. Ephrem's hope was finally starting to fade. He had been silencing a voice in the back of his mind for weeks now, but in spite of his efforts, the voice had been steadily growing louder. Now, finally, it was clearly audible to his dispirited mind. "You've made the wrong choice in coming here. You shouldn't have come. Just as Ephraim was about to finally give in to this discouraging conviction, something happened. A glint of gold shone in the center of Ephraim's strainer, and not a little one. This one was big. At first he didn't realize how big, but as he continued to move his strainer back and forth and the mud emptied around the nugget, Ephraim became amazed and then ecstatic. He had a gold nugget in his strainer that was the size of his thumb. After examining the nugget unbelievingly, Ephraim dispatched it safely into his pocket and dug with his strainer again in the same place. Sift, sift, sift. More gold. He did it again. Even more gold nuggets, this time even bigger than the first one. By the time Ephraim was done for the day, his pockets were bulging with gold. Since it was now too dark to keep mining, Ephraim cut a strip in the grass nearby with his pocket knife. Before, before putting it in his back pocket, he normally kept it in his front pocket, and got up to head to his campfire for the night. So notice that's my first main event, which can just be summarized with one sentence: Ephraim found gold. Now, my second main event is my second main body paragraph. Just as Ephraim was rising to go, he heard a crack in the bushes nearby. He looked up to see a tattered looking man staring at him. As he took the man in, 5 other men, lazy looking, slovenly men, stepped out of the bushes, all with their 6 shooters out and grim eyes trained on Ephraim. From the expressions on their faces and from their pistols, Ephraim could tell they meant him no good. Well, 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 look what we got here, a Mick, taunted one of them, and then spat on the ground. Looks like we caught ourselves a leprechaun, snarled the oldest of the men with a nasty grin on his ugly, weathered face. And leprechauns always has gold. What's that you got in your pocket, little leprechaun? Asked a sarcastic looking younger man with a scraggly beard. I reckon it's gold, said a man with unkempt brown hair. Our gold, he continued. Ephraim said nothing. I think you're gonna have to come with us, boy, said the first man while wiping his mouth on his sleeve after spitting chaw on the ground. Excuse me for a second, the phone's ringing. Mr. Dauber speaking. Oh, he's actually at PE. Yeah, thanks, bye. Okay, let's get back to this here. Where were we? I think you're going to have to come with us, boy, said the first man while wiping his mouth on his sleeve after spitting chaw on the ground. Ephraim had no choice but to obey. He was taken to the men's campsite and tied to a tree after having his pockets emptied into a dirty sack the oldest of the men held in his hands. As the gold poured into the sack, the men hollered, laughed, and whistled with glee. Ephraim felt that all his hopes and dreams for a better life were being emptied into the sack. Leaving Ephraim tied to the tree, the men gathered around their campfire where they began drinking and cooking something that bubbled in a pot over the open fire. None was ever offered to Ephraim. As the hours passed and Ephraim got more and more stiff, with his back held tight against the cold, hard wood of the tree, the men got quieter and quieter until finally Ephraim heard the deep sound of steady breathing coming from all of them, and he knew they were asleep. Notice that's my second main body paragraph, and it's also my second main event, which is just Ephraim gets captured and all of his gold gets stolen. This is my third main body paragraph, and it's also my third main event. Now that the men were asleep, Ephraim said a Hail Mary as he began feeling for the knife he had fortunately put in his back pocket after cutting the strip of grass next to the river. He could just reach it. Because of the way his hands were tied, it was very difficult to turn the blade upward and toward the ropes. But somehow he managed it. He began slowly sawing at the thick, rough rope with the knife. The strain on his hands and wrists was enormous, and before he was halfway done, the sweat was beading off his forehead. Once, one of the men stirred, and Ephrem thought he was about to wake up, but he only mumbled something that sounded like, "Mustard, please," and rolled over and went back to sleep. After what felt like hours, but was probably more like 15 minutes, the ropes were lying in a heap by the base of the tree, and Ephraim was tiptoeing amongst the sleeping figures trying to reach the sack of gold, his gold. He had kept his eyes glued to it as best he could while he was tied to the tree, and so he knew where it was. Hardly daring to breathe, Ephraim picked up the sack of gold. He thought for sure the clinking would wake them, but miraculously it didn't, and walked away from the campsite as quietly as he could. As soon as he was far enough to dare, he began running, and he didn't stop for miles. He splashed across countless streams and through endless brambles, trying as hard as he could to put as much distance between himself and those good for nothing robbers as he could before sunup. By mid, now notice that was my third main body paragraph, and it was also my third main event. Ephraim escapes and gets back his gold. Now, my last paragraph, which is my conclusion paragraph, and it just wraps up the whole story. By mid morning the next day, Ephraim had already reached Sutter's Mill, paid for passage on a horse drawn wagon, and was on his way to San Francisco. From there, he would travel back to New York. He had had enough of being a miner and was excited to get back home. As he drifted off to a much needed sleep on the wagon, Ephraim smiled, thinking of what his parents' face would look like when he showed them what he was bringing home. Life would be different now. He had made his fortune. And that's my story. And so, if you want to write a story a simple way, make your first paragraph hook the reader, introduce your main character and the setting. And remember, the setting can be any setting we've studied in history this year. It's a historical novel, so it has to be a real life setting that we've actually studied. And then break your story up into three main events, which you can plan out in advance. Do one paragraph for each of those main events. And notice I also started a new line for every time somebody new talks. That's a common thing that people do when they're writing stories. But I keep it in this same paragraph because I don't skip an entire line. And so one paragraph for each of your three main events, and then make your conclusion paragraph, wrap up the story. Well, I hope you enjoyed my story, and I hope you have fun writing your own narrative set again in any of the historical periods that we have studied in fifth grade. And I can't wait to read your stories, and I will see you next time. Signing off.